She was left to die beneath the desert sun, tied to a cactus by a man who called himself her father. But from that blistering cross, Nora Blackwood rose not as a daughter, but as the fire that would cleanse her world. The ropes bit into Nora Blackwood's wrists, not as a punishment for a single act of defiance, but as the final brutal sermon in her stepfather's long and twisted gospel. He tied her to a cactus, leaving her under the searing New Mexico sun as a sacrifice to his own wounded pride. Hello, my dear friend. This is Arthur Blackwood, your narrator of historical tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. The saguaro stood like a silent, thorny sentinel on the arid plains, its arms outstretched as if in a grotesque welcome for Nora. It was a cross, and the scorching heat was the fire of a hell she had never earned. Her world, once defined by the vast open skies of the West, had shrunk to the space between her own shuddering breaths. This was the landscape of Barren Creek Ranch, a place ruled by Colton Hayes, a man in his 50s whose faith was carved from stone and whose heart held all the warmth of a shadow. He was Nora's stepfather, and he saw her spirit not as a thing of beauty, but as a wild weed to be uprooted from his meticulously controlled garden. He read his Bible with a finger that traced verses of wrath and obedience, skipping over any mention of mercy. In his eyes, Nora's quiet strength, the gentle way she spoke to the ranch hands, the defiance spark that lit her gaze. When he spoke of duty, it was all a sin, a personal affront to the order he had imposed upon his small kingdom. The tension in their clapboard house was a living thing, as real as the dust that settled on every surface. It was in the scrape of a chair at the dinner table, the deliberate way Colton Hayes sharpened his knives, the suffocating silence that followed every one of Nora's unanswered questions. She was 20, a woman grown, yet she was treated as little more than chattel, a part of the property to be managed, and eventually traded the breaking point. The sin that led her to the saguaro was a matter of commerce dressed up as matrimony. Colton Hayes had commanded her to marry Bram Hargrove, a cattleman whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty. He was nearly 30 years her senior, a man with hands like weathered slabs of rock and eyes that looked at a woman, the same way they looked at a prize heifer. The union would consolidate their lands, creating an empire of dust and scrub. But when Colton Hayes presented the arrangement, Nora had refused. She had stood before him, small but unbroken, and declared that her soul was not a parcel of land to be bartered for influence. That refusal had unsealed a well of fury in Colton Hayes that was biblical in its scope. He saw not a daughter defending her right to love, but a vessel of disobedience, possessed by the devil of free will. He dragged her from the house, her protests swallowed by the vast indifferent landscape. He pushed her through the brush, far from any prying eyes, to the place where the saguaro stood. As he bound her wrists with rough spun rope, his gaze fell upon the small silver locket at her throat, a keepsake from the mother he had tried so hard to erase from the ranch's memory. It was her mother's gentleness, her mother's untamed spirit that he saw in Nora's eyes, and it was this ghost he sought to exorcise under the unforgiving Sunday. He pronounced his sentence with the finality of a judge, his voice devoid of all emotions save for a cold, righteous anger. She would remain there until the desert broke her will, or until God saw fit to forgive her insolence. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, his silhouette shrinking against the horizon, leaving her to the silence, the sun, and the slow creeping despair. The heat was a physical weight pressing down. Stealing the air from her lungs, the scent of hot sand and dry creosote filled her senses. As the hours bled one into the next, the world began to warp and shimmer. The horizon dissolved into a wavy line of heat, and the sky turned a blinding metallic white. Her consciousness began to fray, drifting between moments of searing pain and blessed dark oblivion. But as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood and fire, a change occurred in the landscape. Out of the shimmering curtain of heat, a shape detached itself. It moved with a purpose the desert understood. Silent, patient, and absolute. A figure walking out of the mirage, not toward the ranch, but directly toward the girl and the cactus that held her captive. The figure that solidified from the desert's shimmering breath was not an angel, but something far more real. To Nora's sun-scorched eyes, he seemed born of the earth itself, lean, silent, with skin the color of rich riverbed clay. He wore buckskin leggings, and his hair, long and black, was held back by a simple leather band. This was Takoda, a scout of the Apache people, a man who lived in the spaces between worlds, belonging fully to none. His face was a mask of calm neutrality, but his eyes, dark and sharp, took in the scene with an unnerving completeness. They saw the crime, the cruelty, and the last flickering ember of life in the woman tied to the cactus. He moved not with the hurried gait of a rescuer, but with the deliberate, unhesitating grace of a predator that has chosen its path. The desert had taught him that wasted motion was wasted life, and every step he took was precise, measured, and absolute. He did not speak. Words were currency in the towns, often spent on lies and empty promises. But here in the heart of the raw and honest wilderness, only actions held truth. He knelt beside her, his presence a sudden shield against the relentless heat. From a sheath at his side he drew a knife. The blade was not the ornate, silver-inlaid weapon of a showman, but a tool honed and practical. Its edge glinted with a lethal purpose. And for a fleeting, terrifying moment, Nora Blackwood's heart seized a final surge of fear in a body that had little left to give. But the blade was not meant for her. With a flick of his wrist, Takoda severed the first rope. The sound was a sharp, definitive snap, a punctuation mark at the end of Colton Hayes' sermon. He worked quickly, his movements economical, slicing through the thick fibers that bit into her raw skin. As the last cord fell away, Nora Blackwood's body, devoid of will or strength, slumped forward. Before she could hit the ground, he was there, catching her with a surprising gentleness, his arm a steady band against her back. The sudden release of pressure sent waves of dizzying pain through her limbs, and the world dissolved into a black, swirling vortex. Takoda held her, feeling the fragile bird-like flutter of her heart against his arm. And now the true test began. To cut her free was an act of instinct, a response to a violation of a code far older than any settler's law. But to take her with him was an act of war. He was Apache. She was white in the eyes of her people. He was not a savior. He was a kidnapper, a savage. To be found with her would mean a posse, a rope, and a swift, brutal end. He could leave her here with his water-skin, a small offering to fate. He looked at her face, pale beneath the grime, and tears at the bloody welts on her wrists. He looked back toward the distant smudge on the horizon that was the Barren Creek Ranch. He knew with the certainty of a man who understands the predators of both the four-legged and two-legged variety that leaving her was the same as killing her. Her stepfather or the desert itself would finish the job. A profound stillness settled over him as he weighed his solitary, quiet life against the life of this stranger. He had long walked a lonely path, a ghost in his own ancestral lands, and his survival depended on leaving no trace, on creating no ripples. To take her would be to hurl a boulder into the placid water of his existence. As he made his decision, his gaze swept the ground around the cactus, one last time reading the story left in the dust. He saw Colton Hayes' heavy boot prints, the drag marks of Nora Blackwood's heels. But then he saw something else. Half hidden by a clump of sagebrush, almost completely buried in the sand, was a small, flat piece of wood, no bigger than his thumb. It wasn't driftwood. It had been carved deliberately, with a symbol, a snake coiling around a cracked cattle skull. Takoda's blood ran cold. This was not the mark of a rancher. It was the sign of Hank Dobbs, a ruthless gang of land grabbers who used terror and intimidation to drive settlers from their claims, buying up the land for pennies. They were ghosts whispered about in saloons, their crimes often blamed on Apache raids. Suddenly, the scene before him shifted. This was not a simple act of domestic cruelty. Colton Hayes' calculated brutality, the public display of it on his own land, was a message, a warning. And this woman, his stepdaughter, was the parchment on which it had been written. He now understood that by interfering, he had not just stumbled into a family dispute. He had stepped into the middle of a shadow war for the very soul of this territory. The choice was no longer a choice. It was an imperative. To leave her now would be to hand her back to a man far more dangerous than just a cruel zealot. He was a pawn, or perhaps a king in a much deadlier game. With a resolve that settled deep in his bones, Takoda gently adjusted his hold on Nora Blackwood, lifting her completely into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. He pulled a worn wool blanket from his horse's pack and wrapped it around her, cocooning her from the cooling evening air. He turned his back to the ranch, to the world of fences and deeds and brutal patriarchs. He faced the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, a sanctuary of stone and shadow that he knew better than any mapmaker. The sun touched the horizon, setting the world ablaze, casting their single-merged shadow, long and stark, across the desert floor. With a deep, steadying breath, he took the first step. It was a step away from the cactus, away from the scene of the crime. It was a step across a threshold, a deliberate stride into a future that was now inextricably bound to the unconscious woman in his arms. The old world was behind them, and with that single resolute step, the path back had vanished forever. Nora Blackwood returned to the world in pieces. Not in a rush of light and sound, but as a slow creeping tide of sensation. The first thing she felt was softness beneath her, the dense, springy texture of an animal fur, a world away from the sharp thorns of the cactus. The next was the scent of wood smoke, clean and sharp, mingled with the damp, mineral smell of a place deep within the earth. She heard the gentle hiss and crackle of a small fire, and somewhere in the distance the echo of dripping water. When she finally found the strength to open her eyes, the sight that greeted her was not the blinding sky, but a ceiling of rock, its contours dancing in the warm, flickering light of the fire. She was in a cave, an alcove tucked into the belly of a mountain, a secret place hidden from the sun. It wasn't a den, but a sanctuary. Dried herbs hung in fragrant bunches from protrusions in the rock, and smooth river stones were arranged near the fire pit. In one corner, water seeped from a crack in the wall, trickling into a hollowed-out stone basin, creating a pool of water, so clear it seemed to hold the darkness of the mountain's heart. Takoda sat on the other side of the fire. His posture was relaxed but alert. He was sharpening the edge of his knife against a wet stone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound besides the fire and the water. He seemed to be a part of the cave, as natural and silent as the rock itself. When he noticed her stirring, he stopped. Their eyes met across the flames. There was no smile of welcome, no soft words of comfort. His expression remained unreadable, his gaze intense, watchful. He was assessing her the way a tracker assesses a new trail, looking for signs of strength, of weakness, of what was to come. He rose and, using a gourd, dipped it into the basin and brought it to her. He knelt and offered it without a word. For a moment, Nora Blackwood flinched, the memory of her stepfather's violence fresh. But the thirst was a fire in her throat, a more immediate and demanding master than her fear. Her hands trembled as she took the gourd, the cool clay a balm against her skin. She drank deeply the water, a shocking, life-giving miracle. After she had her fill, Takoda gestured toward her wrists. It wasn't a request, but a quiet statement of intent. He had a small clay bowl filled with a dark, fragrant paste. He took her arm, his touch surprisingly deft and impersonal, and began to apply the poultice to the raw, rope-burned skin. The mixture was cool and soothing, immediately easing the burning sting. He worked in absolute silence, his focus entirely on the task. His movements were efficient, wasting nothing. Yet there was a current of care in his touch that was entirely new to her. It was the care of a craftsman, for his work of a healer for a wound. As he tended to her other wrist, his fingers brushed against the silver locket at her throat. He paused. His entire body went still, his attention snagged by the small object. He looked from the locket to her eyes, and for the first time he made a clear request. A slight upward tilt of his chin, a question without words. Hesitantly, Nora Blackwood lifted the chain from around her neck and placed the locket in his outstretched palm. She had never thought much of it, only that it was her mother's, the one thing of beauty and softness in a world of harsh angles. Takoda turned it over. The front was smooth and unadorned, but on the back, almost invisible with age, was an etching. It was not the cursive script of a settler's jeweler. It was a symbol, precise and deliberate, a stylized hawk in flight, its wings spread wide, and directly above its head a single six-pointed star. Takoda's breath caught in a barely audible sound. His eyes, which had been so guarded, so distant, now bored into her, searching her face for a story she didn't know she carried. He recognized the mark. It was the symbol of the Skywatcher clan, a lineage of his own people known for their wisdom and their connection to the stars. A clan that was thought to have been completely wiped out 2 generations ago in a brutal massacre that was spoken of only in whispers. The world shifted. This woman was not merely a lost settler, a piece of flotsam caught in a dangerous current. She was a living, breathing paradox, a carrier of a legacy that belonged to his world, not hers. The knowledge settled between them, heavy and unspoken. He gently placed the locket back in her hand. His expression now a complex mixture of shock and a dawning somber responsibility. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackling of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, rough and gravelly, as if he were unaccustomed to using it. He did not speak of the locket, not yet. He spoke of the reality that now bound them. He told her that her name was being carried on the wind, tied to a story of a savage abduction. He told her that her stepfather and the man she was meant to marry were leading a posse, and that their hunt was not one of rescue but of vengeance. To return to Willow Creek was impossible. Her truth would be buried with her body. To be found meant death for them both. He looked at her, his eyes holding the weight of the mountain that sheltered them. He was offering her his protection, but it came with a price. It was not a price to be paid to him, but to the world itself. He could not simply keep her. She had to choose to survive. That life you knew is gone, he said, his voice leaving no room for false hope. You can be the woman they are hunting and they will find you, or you can learn the ways of this land and become a shadow within it. I can teach you, but I will not drag a ghost behind me. You must decide if you want to live. Takoda's words were a hard truth, his gaze fixed on Nora Blackwood as she lay in the quiet darkness of the cave. Her answer came not in words. It came in the pre-dawn chill, just as the first light began to edge over the jagged horizon. When Takoda woke, he found her hunched over the cold ashes of the fire pit, her brow furrowed with determination. As she fumbled with the dry kindling, trying to coax a flame to life with the awkward patience of someone who had never learned the ways of fire, she failed, only managing to stir up a plume of smoke. But in that moment the message was clear. She had made her choice. She wouldn't be the woman they hunted. She would become the shadow they could not catch. And so Takoda's teaching began. The desert, which had nearly been her tomb, became her classroom, and Takoda, the silent man who had saved her, was now her reluctant and demanding tutor. He taught her the art of silence, the way to move through the treacherous landscape without leaving a trace, without disturbing a single stone. At first, every step Nora took felt like a thunderous crash in the otherwise quiet world. Takoda would stop, turn, and point silently at a startled lizard or the startled birds fleeing from a bush she had brushed past. It was a quiet rebuke, more potent than any scolding, but Nora was desperate and determined. Day by day her movements became more fluid, her senses sharper. She learned that the frantic buzz of insects could signal the location of water. The sudden silence of the canyon wrens was a warning that a predator was near. Takoda taught her to read the earth itself. She learned to distinguish the tracks of a deer from those of a wolf, to tell the age of a trail by the dryness of the soil, and to know that the way flowers bloomed could predict the coming seasons. He showed her which plants brought life and which brought swift, agonizing death. Nora memorized the jagged edge of the eucalypt, the bitter taste of mesquite beans, and the vibrant red of the poisonous nightshade berry. Her hands, once delicate and soft, became calloused and strong from digging for roots and stripping bark to make cordage. Her body, once confined by layers of silk and stays, grew lean and resilient, hardened by the desert sun and the harsh winds. The desert had tried to break her, but Takoda was forging her anew using the desert's wisdom. Their shared silence changed over time. It wasn't the tense, wary silence of strangers, but the comfortable, efficient silence of two people working together, their minds and bodies moving in harmony toward a single purpose: survival. Words became fewer. A glance, a subtle hand gesture spoke volumes. Takoda began to see beyond her skin, recognizing the strength in her spirit, while Nora began to understand that his quiet stoicism wasn't a lack of feeling, but a profound, abiding strength. The first true test of her transformation came from a threat that didn't come from the outside, but from within their small two-person tribe. Takoda's horse, a sturdy Mustang that was their only hope for swift escape if needed, had gashed its leg on a sharp outcrop of rock. The wound festered in the heat, swelling with infection. The animal grew listless, favoring the leg, its eyes clouded with pain. Takoda, whose knowledge of healing was focused on two-legged creatures, became frustrated. He did what he could to clean the wound, but the infection was deep and his remedies weren't working. Their ability to move to escape was crippled. Their chances of outrunning a posse had shrunk to zero. As Nora watched him, helpless, a memory surfaced, a memory of her mother. Not in the oppressive house of Barren Creek, but in the small, vibrant garden where her mother had kept books filled with lore on animal husbandry and herbal remedies. Nora had spent countless hours with her, learning which plants soothed a cough in a calf, which poultices could draw the poison from a snake bite. It was knowledge she had always had, but had dismissed as simple domestic craft. Now Nora found her voice steady and clear. She told Takoda about a plant, a desert marigold with fuzzy gray-green leaves, and a type of clay she knew could be found near the seep in their cave. He looked at her with skepticism, his desperation fighting against her certainty. But he saw the resolve in her eyes, and with a curt nod, he went to search for what she described. While he was gone, she approached the horse, murmuring soft words to calm it, just as her mother had taught her. She ran a gentle hand down its neck, soothing its tremors. When Takoda returned, Nora crushed the leaves, mixed them with the clay and a little water, forming a thick, pungent paste. She applied it to the swollen leg, her touch confident. It was a reversal of their roles. Takoda, the master of this land, stood back and watched as she, the novice, worked magic he didn't understand. They both watched and waited. By nightfall, the heat in the horse's leg had lessened, and by the next morning, the swelling had gone down. For the first time in days, the animal put weight on the hoof. A quiet, profound respect passed between them in the morning light. She had saved their escape route, not with the skills he had taught her, but with a piece of the world she had been forced to leave behind. However, their small victory was short-lived. That evening, as a fragile peace settled over their hidden camp, Takoda climbed the rocks above the cave to survey the surrounding territory. He signaled for her to join him. From their high perch, the vast expanse of the desert stretched below them, painted in deep purples and fiery oranges as the sun set. It was beautiful, but their attention was drawn to the valley floor. In the distance, a thin, persistent plume of dust rose against the darkening sky. It wasn't the whimsical swirl of a dust devil, nor the haze of a distant fire. It moved with the steady, relentless pace of mounted men. A posse. Colton Hayes' posse. They were closer, far closer than they should have been. The trail Takoda had so carefully laid to mislead them had failed. The hunters were no longer a distant threat, a story told to spur her training. They were a visible, approaching reality. A serpent of dust and vengeance, slithering directly toward their sanctuary. The time for learning was over. The hunt had arrived. The distant plume of dust was a death sentence, written across the sky. Nora Blackwood's first instinct was to run. A primal urge to flee that was immediately silenced by the stillness of the man beside her. Takoda did not move. He watched the approaching riders with the unblinking focus of a hawk, his mind already mapping the terrain, calculating the wind, measuring the remaining light. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. He turned to her, his face grim but resolute. There was no time to run. The horse was not ready, and they would be caught in the open within a mile. Their sanctuary, the mountain, was now their only fortress. He laid out the plan with swift clipped phrases. A narrow canyon, a natural bottleneck, was the only direct approach to their position. He would climb to the unstable scree slope above it and trigger a rock slide. It was a desperate gamble. If it worked, it would block the pass, buying them a full day, maybe more, to escape over the mountain's far side. If it failed, it would alert the posse to their exact location and trap them against the rock face. He left her hidden in the shadows of the cave, pressing a small leather pouch into her hand. "If I do not return by the time the moon is highest," he said, his words heavy with unspoken meaning, "go east. Follow the stars, do not stop." It was the closest he had ever come to saying goodbye. "And follow then." From her hiding place, Nora Blackwood watched his lean form melt into the twilight, moving with impossible speed and silence up the treacherous slope. She could hear the posse now, the faint metallic clink of bridles and the low murmur of voices carried on the evening breeze. The sounds were a drumbeat counting down the final moments. She waited, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, for the thunderous roar that would signal their salvation or their doom. But the sound that came was wrong. It was not a roar, but a sharp crack followed by a sickening grinding slide and a single sharp cry of pain that was abruptly cut off silence. A terrible absolute silence that was worse than any noise. Every lesson Takoda had taught her screamed at her to stay hidden, to obey his last command and flee. But a force stronger than fear pulled her from the shadows. She scrambled toward the pass, her movements now as swift and sure as his. She found him on a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon. The rock slide he'd intended to create had betrayed him. A section of the slope had given way prematurely, and his leg was pinned beneath a gray slab of granite, trapping him in the open. Below, the posse had halted, alerted by the noise. She could hear Colton Hayes' voice, harsh and commanding, echoing up the canyon walls. They were searching, their lanterns beginning to cut cones of yellow light into the deepening darkness. The crisis was absolute. Takoda, the invincible man of the mountains, was helpless, and she was alone with nothing but his teachings and her own desperate will to save them. Her mind raced. The boulder was immense. She could never move it by strength alone. She needed leverage. As she frantically scanned the surrounding rock face for a tool, a sturdy branch, anything, her eyes caught something on the rock wall just behind Takoda. It was a carving weathered by time but unmistakable in the fading light. A snake, coiled around a cracked cattle skull. The symbol of Hank Dobbs, the mark from the wooden chip. A wave of ice-cold clarity washed over her. It was not a coincidence. Colton Hayes had not tracked them here through brilliant skill. He had been led. This secret place, this sanctuary, was a known location, a waypoint for his monstrous associates. This was not a pursuit. It was an appointment. They had been herded into this canyon like livestock to a slaughterhouse. The realization did not break her. It forged her fear into a blade of cold, hard fury. She saw it then, a long dead branch of ironwood, thick as her arm, wedged in a fissure 50 feet away. She scrambled toward it. Her fingers found purchase in the rock. Her movements, fueled by adrenaline and rage, were quick and desperate. She dragged the heavy branch back to the ledge, jamming one end beneath the boulder, pinning Takoda. She piled smaller rocks beneath the branch, creating a crude fulcrum. It was a desperate, impossible gamble. She put her entire weight on the end of the lever. Her muscles screamed in protest. The wood groaned. The boulder shifted. A mere inch, but an inch of hope. At the same time, using her feet, she pushed against a smaller, precariously balanced rock formation near the edge of the ledge. The two actions, combined one of leverage, one of a desperate kick, were just enough. With a deafening groan, the entire section of the ledge where she was working gave way. A river of rock and debris thundered down into the canyon below. A far greater and more chaotic avalanche than Takoda could have ever planned. Shouts of panic and the terrified whinnying of horses rose from the darkness, followed by the crashing finality of the past being sealed. She had done it. She had saved them. She slid back to Takoda amidst the dust and settling stones. Using the branch again, she was able to pry the granite slab, just enough for him to wrench his mangled leg free. He was alive, breathing in ragged gasps, his face pale with pain. He looked at her, his eyes wide in the gloom. The look was not one of simple gratitude. It was the look of stunned awe from a master seeing his student not just equal his skill, but surpass it in a moment of impossible crisis. But mixed with the awe was a new and terrible understanding. His gaze shifted from her face to the syndicate's symbol on the rock behind him, then back. He had seen it too. Her heroic act had not brought them relief, only a more terrifying clarity. He gripped her arm, his fingers tight, his voice a raw whisper scraped from his throat by pain and dawning horror. He did not thank her. He gave her the truth. This was never a hunt, he rasped, his eyes locking onto hers. It was a trap, and this mountain is the bait. The thunder of the rockslide faded, replaced by a ringing silence and the distant impotent shouts of the men trapped below. Dust thick and chalky settled over the ledge, a ghostly shroud on the scene of their desperate victory. But there was no triumph in Takoda's eyes, only the grim acceptance of a new, more dangerous reality. The mountain that had been their fortress was now their prison. His leg was a ruin of shattered bone and torn flesh, and the look on his face told Nora Blackwood that the path of the lone wanderer had come to a brutal, grinding halt. In that moment, the roles that had defined them, teacher and student savior and survivor, crumbled away. He was now the one who was helpless, and she the one who had to provide. She drew on a deep well of resilience she never knew. She possessed a fusion of his harsh wilderness teachings and the gentle healing knowledge passed down from her mother. She fashioned a splint from the ironwood branch that had served as her lever, binding his leg with strips of cloth torn from the last vestiges of her old life, her petticoat. She cleaned the wound with water from their basin and packed it with a poultice of chewed yarrow leaves to stem the bleeding. Her hands steady, her focus absolute. Takoda watched her, his defenses stripped away by pain. A flicker of something akin to wonder in his dark eyes. The days that followed were a blur of quiet routine, a fragile domesticity forged in the crucible of their shared danger. Their world shrank to the confines of the firelit cave and the small clearing outside its mouth. With Takoda directing her from his bed of furs, Nora Blackwood became the hunter and gatherer. She set his snares catching rabbits and quail. She learned to identify the subtlest signs of his presence. The way he would gesture with his head toward a particular plant, she should gather the minute shift in his expression that told her a sound on the wind was harmless. In the long evenings, as the fire danced and cast their shadows against the ancient rock, a new kind of communication bloomed in the space between them. He would speak, his voice low, telling her the names of the stars in his language stories of the coyote and the eagle. She in turn told him of her mother, of the garden she had tended, a small patch of defiant beauty in the harsh world of Barren Creek Ranch. They were two solitary souls sharing the fragments of their broken worlds, and in the telling, the pieces began to fit together in unexpected ways. One evening, he was re-examining the intricate carvings on her silver locket. He spoke of the Skywatcher clan, the people of the hawk and the star. He told her they were astronomers, storytellers, who believed that a person's destiny was written in the stars at the moment of their birth. It forged her fear into a blade of cold, hard fury. She saw it then, a long dead branch of ironwood thick as her arm wedged in a fissure 50 feet away. She scrambled toward it. Her fingers found purchase in the rock. Her movements, fueled by adrenaline and rage, were sharp and frantic. She dragged the heavy branch back to the ledge, jamming one end beneath the boulder, pinning Takoda. She piled smaller rocks beneath the branch, creating a crude fulcrum. It was a desperate, impossible gamble. She put her entire weight on the end of the lever. Her muscles screamed in protest. The wood groaned. The boulder shifted. A mere inch. But an inch of hope. At the same time, using her feet, she pushed against a smaller, precariously balanced rock formation near the edge of the ledge. The two actions combined, one of leverage, one of a desperate kick, were just enough. With a deafening groan, the entire section of the ledge where she was working gave way. A river of rock and debris thundered down into the canyon below, a far greater and more chaotic avalanche than Takoda could have ever planned. Shouts of panic and the terrified whinnying of horses rose from the darkness, followed by the crashing finality of the past being sealed. She had done it. She had saved them. She slid back to Takoda amidst the dust and settling stones. Using the branch again, she was able to pry the granite slab just enough for him to wrench his mangled leg free. He was alive. Breathing in ragged gasps, his face pale with pain. He looked at her, his eyes wide in the gloom. The look was not one of simple gratitude. It was the look of stunned awe from a master seeing his student not just equal his skill, but surpass it in a moment of impossible crisis. But mixed with the awe was a new and terrible understanding. His gaze shifted from her face to the Hank Dobbs symbol on the rock behind him, then back. He had seen it too. Her heroic act had not brought them relief, only a more terrifying clarity. He gripped her arm, his fingers tight, his voice a raw whisper, scraped from his throat by pain and dawning horror. He did not thank her. He gave her the truth. This was never a hunt. He rasped, his eyes locking onto hers. It was a trap, and this mountain is the bait. The thunder of the rockslide faded, replaced by a ringing silence and the distant impotent shouts of the men trapped below. Dust thick and chalky settled over the ledge. A ghostly shroud on the scene of their desperate victory. But there was no triumph in Takoda's eyes, only the grim acceptance of a new, more dangerous reality. The mountain that had been their fortress was now their prison. His leg was a ruin of shattered bone and torn flesh, and the look on his face told Nora Blackwood that the path of the lone wanderer had come to a brutal, grinding halt. In that moment, the roles that had defined them, teacher and student, savior and survivor, crumbled away. He was now the one who was helpless, and she the one who had to provide. She drew on a deep well of resilience. She never knew she possessed a fusion of his harsh wilderness teachings and the gentle, healing knowledge passed down from her mother. She fashioned a splint from the ironwood branch that had served as her lever, binding his leg with strips of cloth, torn from the last vestiges of her old life, her petticoat. She cleaned the wound with water from their basin and packed it with a poultice of chewed yarrow leaves to stem the bleeding. Her hands steady, her focus absolute. Takoda watched her, his defenses stripped away by pain, a flicker of something akin to wonder in his dark eyes. The days that followed were a blur of quiet routine, a fragile domesticity forged in the crucible of their shared danger. Their world shrank to the confines of the firelit cave and the small clearing outside its mouth. With Takoda directing her from his bed of furs, Nora Blackwood became the hunter and gatherer. She set his snares, catching rabbits and quail. She learned to identify the subtlest signs of his presence. The way he would gesture with his head toward a particular plant, she should gather the minute shift in his expression that told her a sound on the wind was harmless. In the long evenings, as the fire danced and cast their shadows against the ancient rock, a new kind of communication bloomed in the space between them. He would speak, his voice low, telling her the names of the stars in his language, stories of the coyote and the eagle. She in turn told him of her mother, of the garden she had tended. a small patch of defiant beauty in the harsh world of barren Creek Ranch. They were two solitary souls, sharing the fragments of their broken worlds, and in the telling, the pieces began to fit together in unexpected ways. One evening, as he was re-examining the intricate carvings on her silver locket, he spoke of the Skywatcher clan, the people of the Hawk and the Star. He told her they were astronomers, storytellers who believed that a person's destiny was written in the stars at the moment of their birth. For a moment, they thought they had found a refuge, a brief chance to breathe, but that refuge was an ambush. They weren't alone. Colton Hayes and Bram Hargrove stood waiting for them at the far side of the clearing, rifles held at the ready. Their faces, illuminated by the hellish glow of the fire behind them, were twisted into masks of triumphant cruelty. But it was the third man, standing with them, that made Nora Blackwood's blood run cold. It was Gus Malone of Willow Creek, a silver star pinned to his chest, his holster unbuttoned, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He wasn't there to dispense justice. His eyes, small and hard, held the same predatory glint as the others. The law wasn't coming to save her. The law had been bought and paid for by the Hank Dobbs syndicate. The full monstrous scope of the conspiracy was laid bare. Colton Hayes wasn't just a tyrant on his own ranch. He was a protected agent of a larger evil, and the arm of the law was just another weapon in his arsenal. "Well now, Nora Blackwood," Colton Hayes' voice boomed across the clearing, oozing with a sickening paternalistic authority. "Look what the wind blew in. Seems this savage has finally tired of you." Bram Hargrove let out a low chuckle, his eyes devouring her. No longer a suitor, but a slaver reclaiming his property. She'll need a strong hand to undo the devilment he's taught her. Hargrove sneered, spitting a wad of tobacco near her feet. Gus Malone stepped forward, his voice flat and official, a grotesque parody of justice. "Bram Hargrove of the Apache," he declared, though there was no one to hear but the condemned, "you are under arrest for the abduction and corruption of a white woman. The sentence is death by hanging." Bram Hargrove, despite his shattered leg, pushed himself upright, using his crutch as a weapon, his body a shield between Nora Blackwood and the men. A low growl emanated from his chest, the sound of an animal, cornered and ready to die fighting. Nora Blackwood looked from Hargrove's defiant, hopeless stand to the cold, dead eyes of the men who held their lives in their hands. She saw their future in a flash. Takoda would be killed here on this mountain. His death, another crime blamed on the fire, and she would be dragged back, her spirit finally, and completely broken, a prize for Hargrove and a trophy for Colton Hayes. But the girl they were looking at was not the same one who had been tied to the cactus. She was a woman who understood the art of sacrifice. In that heart-stopping moment, she made a choice. She stepped deliberately in front of Takoda, her small frame a defiant barrier. She held up her hand not in surrender, but in a gesture of command that surprised them all into silence. She looked past the leering face of Hargrove, past the corrupt authority of Gus Malone, and locked her eyes onto the one man whose pride ruled all. Her stepfather. Her voice when she spoke did not tremble. It was clear and cold as river stone. "I will go with you," she said. Each word a carefully weighed piece of her soul. "I will marry Mr. Hargrove. I will be the daughter you wanted. I will never speak of this again. My silence, my obedience, everything. You will have it all." She paused, letting the offer settle in the crackling air. In return, she continued, her voice dropping. "You let him go. You give him his life. You ride away from this mountain and you never hunt him again. That is my price." A stunned silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the roar of the fire. She stood a lone, unmoving figure, offering her own life, her own freedom to save his. Colton Hayes' triumphant sneer slowly transformed into a look of cold, calculating consideration. He had her, he had won. The only question that remained was whether he would honor the bargain or simply burn it all to the ground. A cold, thin smile stretched across Colton Hayes' face. Nora Blackwood's surrender was sweeter to him than any victory of arms. He had not broken her body, but her will. And in his twisted worldview, this was a sign of God's own justice. He savored the moment, letting her words hang in the air, a testament to his absolute power. A bargain, he finally said, his voice dripping with magnanimity that was more menacing than any threat. I am a man of my word. He turned to Bram Hargrove, who was already stepping forward to claim his prize, and then to Gus Malone. The girl comes with us. The savage we leave him to God's judgment. But his eyes held a cruel glint. It would not be a clean judgment. Sheriff Colton Hayes commanded, "See to it he doesn't wander far. A man can't outrun the wolves with two broken legs." The order was clear. They would cripple Takoda, leaving him to die a slow, agonizing death from infection or predation. It was a mercy designed by a devil. Gus Malone, his duty to the syndicate clear, drew his heavy pistol, not to shoot, but to use it as a club. He began to walk toward Takoda, who stood braced on his crutch, a magnificent, defiant statue of a man ready to meet his end. Nora Blackwood's heart fractured. Her sacrifice had bought him nothing but a slower execution. In that moment of absolute despair, a desperate strategy ignited in her mind. It was not a plan of force, but of knowledge. She couldn't fight them. But she could fight their arrogance. She could use the very land they sought to conquer as a weapon against them. She threw her head back and let out a sharp, piercing cry, not one of fear, but of warning. The wind, she yelled, her voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. "It's turning. Can't you feel it?" Colton Hayes scoffed. "More of your lies, girl. It's over." But Nora Blackwood's eyes were wild with a terrifying certainty, and she pointed a trembling finger, not at them, but at the giants that ringed the clearing, the ancient ponderosa pines. "Those trees," she cried, her voice ringing with the authority of a prophetess. "Takoda taught me. They're filled with sap like pitch. When the crown fire hits them, they don't just burn. They explode. They will rain fire on this entire clearing." Bram Hargrove laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Listen to the squaw's fantasy." But Gus Malone, a man who had lived in these lands his entire life, hesitated. His eyes flickered nervously toward the tops of the massive trees. He had heard tales from old loggers, whispers of trees that became bombs in a firestorm. As if summoned by her words, a deep resonant groan echoed from the heart of the nearest pine, a sound of wood and water being tortured by unimaginable heat. A shower of brilliant orange sparks erupted from its crown, cascading down like a fiery waterfall. And then the wind, which had been a low moan, shifted. It roared to life, a hot, violent gust that blasted into the clearing, carrying with it the deafening sound of the approaching inferno. The fire was no longer just on the ridge. It was upon them. The posse's horses, their primal instincts screaming at them, went mad. They reared their eyes white with terror, snapping reins and bucking their riders. The entire clearing devolved into a chaos of panicked men and terrified animals. Colton Hayes' authority, built on a foundation of fear and greed, crumbled in the face of a power far greater. This was their chance. Amid the screaming and the smoke, Nora Blackwood lunged toward Takoda. His eyes met hers, and he understood. There was no need for words. With her supporting his good side, he abandoned the crutch. While Colton Hayes and his men fought to control their mounts and escape the coming firestorm, Nora Blackwood and Takoda slipped into the swirling smoke. They moved not toward the open plains, but along a narrow, almost invisible game trail at the edge of the clearing, a path she had noted earlier. A path that led deeper into the rocky heart of the mountain. Their retreat was a quiet, desperate ballet against the backdrop of fiery chaos. The brute force of their enemies had been rendered useless by their own ignorance. Nora Blackwood had not defeated them with a weapon. She had defeated them with wisdom, turning their own fire, their own arrogance against them. The catharsis was not in a gunshot, but in the sight of their perfect, cruel plan being consumed by a force they could not bully and could not buy. As they reached the relative safety of a rock crevice, Nora Blackwood dared one last look back. Colton Hayes had regained control of his horse, his face illuminated by the exploding pines. He was not looking at the fire. He was staring directly at the spot where she had been. His face was a mask of pure murderous rage. His victory had been stolen from him, his authority shattered, and his stepdaughter revealed to be a force he could not comprehend. He bellowed her name, a raw, guttural roar of hatred, but the sound was swallowed by the thunder of the fire. He and Bram Hargrove, their posse scattered, were forced to retreat, beaten and humiliated. The immediate threat was over, but Nora Blackwood knew with chilling certainty that the look on his face was not one of defeat, but of a promise. He had not been killed, only thwarted. His hatred, once a fire contained within his ranch, had now been unleashed upon the entire world. They had won their lives, but in doing so, they had traded a prison for a life on the run, forever hunted by a man who would never ever stop. A year passed, a full cycle of seasons turned, washing the world clean and allowing new life to take root. High in the Dragoon Mountains, in a valley shielded by granite cliffs and ancient pines, Nora Blackwood and Takoda found their sanctuary. It was a place the mapmakers had missed, a pocket of impassable green and blue that the grasping hands of men like Colton Hayes had not yet found. Here they had not just hidden, they had built. Their home was a small, sturdy cabin of stone and timber, nestled against the rock face as if it had sprouted from the earth itself. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney under Nora Blackwood's patient hand, winding up into the sky, a testament to the warmth of their fire. Around the cabin, rows of corn squash and medicinal herbs grew, a defiant patch of order in the untamed land. A cold stream, born from the heart of the mountain, ran nearby, its song a constant soothing presence. This was their new normal, a life measured not in fear, but in the quiet rhythms of the rising sun and the slow turning of the stars. One late autumn afternoon, Nora Blackwood sat near the doorway, grinding dried corn into meal with a smooth stone pestle, her movements efficient and serene. The woman she was now bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had once been tied to a cactus. Her skin was browned by the sun, her hands capable and strong. Her eyes, once clouded with defiance and despair, now held a deep, abiding peace. Takoda sat nearby the afternoon light, catching the silver in his dark hair. He walked with a permanent limp, the legacy of Colton Hayes' hatred etched into his bone, but it was a scar, not a weakness. He moved with quiet grace, his body and the land around him in perfect harmony. In his hands he held a piece of cottonwood, and with a small, sharp knife he was carving his fingers, coaxing a shape from the pale wood. The silence between them was a comfortable blanket woven from 1,000 shared moments, a language of the heart that needed no words. He had taught her the ways of his people, and she had taught him how to carve his spirit into a hawk wings, spread wide as if catching a current of wind, a single star etched above its head. It was the symbol of his clan, a symbol of their shared history. As she took it, her fingers tracing the delicate lines, Takoda told her a story. He had encountered a traveling Apache elder some months before, a man who carried news from many tribes. The elder had spoken of the lands around Willow Creek. He said a great fire, a ghost fire the locals called it, that had swept across the mountain a year ago. The fire, so the story went, had a righteous fury. It had consumed the corrupt town sheriff and scattered a band of ruthless land grabbers who had been preying on the territory. Colton Hayes and Bram Hargrove had survived, but their power was broken, shamed and exposed. Their syndicates shattered. They had become bitter, isolated figures. Their names were now cautionary tales, whispered in the saloons they once ruled. But the strangest part of the legend that grew from the ashes was this. People said the mountain was now protected by spirits, the spirit of a great hawk and a gentle dove who had called down the fire to cleanse the land of its wickedness. Men greedy and superstitious now gave the mountain a wide berth. Nora Blackwood looked at Takoda, a slow wonder dawning on her face. Their desperate act of survival had become a legend. Their escape had not just freed them, it had inadvertently liberated an entire territory and created a myth that would unknowingly guard their new home for generations. Takoda watched her, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. He then reached into his pouch and pulled out something else he had been carving in secret. It was much smaller and infinitely more precious. He placed it in her palm. It was a tiny cradle board, no bigger than her hand, perfect in every detail. In that one silent gesture, a promise was made. Their story was not an ending, it was a beginning. Their lineage, the Skywatchers, clan which had been brought to the brink of extinction, would not die. A new life, a new hope was coming. In the vast and often brutal theater of the West, the grandest stories are seldom those of conquest or gold. They are the quiet epics, written in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silent vows of souls who refuse to be broken. Nora Blackwood and Takoda's story was not one of vengeance, but of reclamation. They learned that home is not a piece of land to be owned, but a sanctuary built with two pairs of hands. They discovered that family is not always the blood you are born with, but the blood you would spill to protect the person who stands beside you. And they found that true freedom is not a life without peril, but the profound courage to build a life of meaning and love. A quiet fire in a world that will always have its shadows. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.